Well, let's get started. My name is Sid Moen. I serve as co-director of Interfaith Action of Southwest Michigan. Delighted to have you join us this evening for our second in our 2022 series on theologies of transformation, actions for justice. We have been taking the month of January and this session in February to provide critiques of the 10 faith principles that were developed last year as part of a 9-month study process looking at Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, and using that as a basis for our reflection to articulate 10 interfaith principles. We've been testing those principles from a variety of very focused theological perspectives. In January, we tested them against Islamic, Jewish, as well as womanist and feminist theological perspectives. This evening, we'll be critiquing them from Black, Latinx, and queer theological perspectives. After we have concluded our testing of our 10 faith principles, we will then make appropriate revisions and begin a monthly discussion process around each of those 10 faith principles. Let me thank the two individuals who facilitated and chaired our study process last year. Bobby Gaunt, former senior warden at All Saints Episcopal in Saugatuck, as well as Clark Gilpin, Dean Emeritus at University of Chicago Divinity School in Stevensville. Our session this evening will be taped so that it can be translated into a podcast for use in small group discussions throughout the year, as well as contribute to being part of a library of resources for interfaith study and action processes. If you'd like to list your affiliation, please feel free to do so in the chat. We also ask you to mute yourself unless you are speaking. Our work can be categorized as a component of doing public theology. Krista Tippett, the host of the popular program On Being, describes the work of public theology in this way. One, it has to emerge from the vast diversity of our modern lives, and in some cases, to uproot our traditional grounds. And secondly, she indicates that it needs to articulate spiritual points of view that challenge and also deepen our thinking on questions in public and political life. So we are delighted to have three guests contribute to our reflections and our articulation of an interfaith public theology. Let me introduce our three discussants for the evening. First, Dr. Timothy Matovina, who is chair of the theology department at Notre Dame University. He specifically works in the area of theology and culture with a specialization in Latinx religion and theology. Dr. Matovina has his PhD from the Catholic University of America, and he'll be commenting this evening specifically from a Latinx theological perspective. Second, guiding us this evening will be Reverend Dr. Jay Johnson, who is the rector at All Saints Episcopal Church in Saugatuck. Jay has served on the leadership of the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies in Religion at the Pacific School of Religion. He is also a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Theology and Sexuality. Jay has his Master's of Divinity from the Nashotah House Episcopal Seminary and his PhD from Graduate Theological Union. Jay will be commenting specifically from a queer theological perspective. Our third discussant is Reverend Canon Dr. Hugh Page. He is a member of the faculty of the Theology Department at Notre Dame. He is a professor in theology with specialization in Africana biblical interpretation as well as Africana studies. Hugh is an Episcopal priest, has his Doctor of Ministry from the Graduate Theological Seminary, and a PhD from Harvard University. Hugh will be commenting specifically from a Black theological perspective. So, Stephen, if you want to share the screen with a quick refresher of our 10 interfaith principles. Stephen has also provided a link to the full text of these principles in the chat, so feel free to click on that link as you like now or later. So let's jump into the discussion. Gentlemen, as you read through and reflected on these 10 principles, was there anything in any of them that you found discordant with your particular theological work?
Sid, you want just to make a short, it's not a speech, just make a short little comment and have a conversation, right?
Precisely, yes. So anything that, you know, as you read through these, you thought, well, there's a tension, a rub with my particular field of theological understanding, theological conceptualization.
Well, I could start. First, I want to say just a couple quick positive things. I think the principles are robust. They speak to a range of critical issues and concerns. I find them passionate and compassionate. So, you know, there's a lot of good in here. I know we're looking at ways they might be sharpened. They resonate with Latinx theologies in many ways: storytelling, racial justice, migration, and so on. Maybe one comment on number 8 on the list. Welcoming the stranger is a phrase used there. And it's very biblical, of course, Judeo and Christian traditions. But there's also another biblical tradition that one might think of including here. From Ephesians, you are strangers and aliens no longer, but fellow citizens and members of the household of God. The notion that we welcome the stranger can unintentionally presuppose that there's a kind of a people who are the citizens, the ones who belong, the ones who count, and the others are strangers, recipients of our largesse or our outreach or someone. Now, it's biblical. I am not criticizing the use of the term. It's very biblical. But in the context of the immigration struggles of sisters and brothers from other places in this country, maybe we're better off talking about you are strangers and aliens no longer, especially in the household of faith, where we're not just about welcoming newcomers. The house of God is not holy because everyone is welcome. The house of God is holy because everyone belongs and is a treasured member of the household by virtue of being a fellow human being. So that was just one thought. Well, I think it's a strong statement. I'm so glad migration is in there. It's one of your principles. The way of speaking about it might speak more prophetically to the realities of the xenophobia of the world that we live in and the country that we live in.
Let me pick up on what I think is a significant comment around the term stranger, and ask you to comment from a Black theological perspective with that a strong tradition. Let me generalize it as found in some spirituals. I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger. So how do you connect to Tim's comment about melding together the different understandings of stranger?
So I'd like to first echo Tim's sentiments about the overall robustness and scope of the 10 aspirational statements, which I think are quite good. In terms of the question that you ask, I'd approach it in a slightly different way. So there is a sense in which this notion of diaspora, of living constantly in a problematized relationship with a homeland, a place that is either an imaginary homeland or that represents an eschatological or teleological dream, a desired destination, or one that perhaps can never be reached, I think is very much a part of certain sectors of the Black theological landscape. And here, I also think it's important as your work goes on to consider the pluriformity of the Black theological tradition. There's a variety of ecclesial families within it, and a sense in which we're beginning at this point just to understand the vast complexity that obtains within the larger Africana world. So on the one hand, it's convenient to speak about certain universals that might actually be a part of the Black religious tradition or the Black Christian tradition. On the other hand, it's also important to appreciate how heterogeneous that experience is and how important it is to use intersectional tools that enable us to understand the extraordinary varieties of thought that exist among those who are a part of that tradition. But I would also, going back to my initial point, say that this issue of being a stranger in a strange land, of seeking to find a homeland, is one that within and outside of certain sectors of that tradition is understood to be an ongoing challenge. Not everyone feels at home within the Black church, who even those who are longstanding members and considered to be pillars. It's not always been an extraordinarily welcoming place for members of the LGBTQ plus community. It has often been a challenging space within which women can exist. And so, I think it's very important to understand how complex that tradition is and the extent to which one can exist in a state of diaspora, even within certain of those traditions that are a part of the Black world.
Let me continue it and indulge me for just, I think, another moment or two to bring Jay into this dialogue around welcoming the stranger, no longer a stranger, the multifaceted aspects of the stranger concept. Jay, a very formative book for me, written by an Episcopalian, John Fortunata, many years ago, entitled Embracing the Exile, Healing Journeys for Gay Christians. Again, somewhat connected to this theme of being a stranger as a temporary or perhaps as a permanent identity. So how do you connect to this concept, I guess, from a queer theological perspective of stranger?
Thanks, Sid. It's a really great question, and I will also echo what both Tim and Hugh have mentioned about this list of principles and aspirations. I think they're really great, and they're evocative, and I think they're generative of a whole range of ways of thinking that can be really useful. And I hope that we can also, by the way, have some conversation about how principles like these can be used in congregational life as well. I mean, I have a particular commitment to that at the moment as the rector of All Saints in Saugatuck, because I would really like to figure out how to bring these robust ideas of public theology more fully into congregational ministry. But that's a much larger question. But to your point and question, Sid, if I could just say briefly, the word queer, of course, is a problematic one for a lot of people in this context. And sometimes that's used as a very shorthand way to talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and the list, the acronym gets longer and longer all the time. And I understand that. And I sometimes use the word that way too. But I mostly use it actually from the perspective of queer theory and critical social theory, by which I mean very broadly sort of articulated, a deep suspicion of identity categories themselves, whether those are sexual or gender identity categories or racial, ethnic, economic categories. A very deep suspicion of them precisely because of the supposition that forms of institutional power use those categories to divide and separate groups of people from each other, in effect making strangers where maybe there weren't strangers to begin with, if you will. So there's a sense in which the word stranger itself needs to be defined in terms of who's using it and in relation to what set of other peoples or groups, strangers to whom. I mean, if I were to speak more directly from the perspective of gay and lesbian communities, that's always hazardous to try to speak for any community, but just from my experience in that world, the idea that we're trying to be welcomed, we gay and lesbian people welcomed into the church as if we haven't always already been there, is a big issue in the history of certainly modern Christianity, which raises the whole question of who is the stranger, and who has the power to welcome, and who defines what the stranger is. So I really appreciate, I think, as Tim said, this evocation of welcoming the stranger as a foundational biblical principle. I think in terms of hospitality as a primary kind of religious spiritual practice, it's really important to keep that sense of welcoming and of being hospitable, but then recognizing that these categories are highly charged with all sorts of power dynamics that can be hidden, sort of lurking around in there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, let me also, I may have taken us on a bit of a detour, but I'm very intrigued with kind of the depth of this discussion about stranger. But any other discordant aspects in this list of 10 principles?
Is it okay if I'll just keep going on that theme for just a second?
Sure, please.
Even though I just spoke. The one thing that I wanted to, and it's related to this notion of stranger too, and also to how I just described my understanding of the word queer and the suspicion of categories and identity labels and so on. In principle number 5, about the common good, I understand why the second sentence, democracy without values becomes relativism. And then a couple sentences down, the last sentence, we are aware that patterns of consumerism and materialism. I sort of bristled a little bit at both of those words, relativism and materialism. And I understand why they're in there, because I've used them myself exactly the way they're in this particular principle. But I think it might be worth, I wouldn't recommend removing them necessarily, but I do think it's worth inviting people into a conversation about what relativism means. So its most basic meaning, I think, is that everything is related to everything else. So that there's the sense of there being any absolute principle kind of dissolves into this notion of, well, relative to what? That's related to what I was saying a moment ago about the word stranger. Stranger in relation to whom and to what? I think relativism is actually a really important principle, to recognize that we are all related to each other in some fashion, and that we are related to institutions and communities in all sorts of different ways. I also understand why relativism is being used the way that it is in that sentence. But I would invite, I think, conversation from groups about how we could engage in a much deeper understanding of how we are related to each other apart from categories and labels. And then real quickly, because I'm talking too much here, but materialism. As a Christian theologian, I would really like to say material reality is great. Like the foundational principle of the incarnation in Christian tradition suggests that there is a deep divine embrace of the physical world, of our bodies, of material reality. And I would like to see Christian communities reclaim being materialistic in a way, of being careful about how we use the word, so that we're not falling into the trap of saying, spirituality is immaterial, or spirituality is non-bodily, or something like that, because our bodies are good and the material world that God has created is good. So how can we make sure that we don't fall into that sort of the material world is somehow bad?
Thank you for that. And Hugh and Tim, chime in here, because the two terms, materialism and relativism, which Jay highlighted, are terms that Pope Francis consistently uses in his speaking, and which we lifted verbatim from Fratelli Tutti. They are kind of core concepts that the Pope references. So how do you connect to those terms?
I'll yield to my colleague Tim, and then I'll offer a comment or two.
I'll maybe say something about relativism, because I do think the Pope, Pope Benedict, and then Pope Francis, maybe they use it a little differently than Jay did. Relativism, not in the sense of relations between people, but relativism in terms of everybody's the source of their own truth. Benedict spoke of a dictatorship of relativism. Everybody's free to believe whatever they want. There's no way to find a common ground, or a search for a common truth. I wonder if that's still, maybe someone could debate whether that was the case then. I think that's certainly true of modern people. Many of us think, people will use words like it's my truth, or that's, truth. And of course, I don't think people are just talking about the fact that all beliefs, all truth claims are contextualized. There is, sociology of knowledge. There are power dynamics in the creation of knowledge. But even beyond that, there are ways where people sort of just feel like, well, truth is whatever I decide it is, without going through the hard work of debating with one another. But I wonder if we're actually still in that situation in the age of Trump. I don't see relativism so much of that type, where everyone says, well, to each his own. You believe what you believe, I believe what I believe, that's my personal choice, that's your personal choice. No, on the contrary, our politics today are fraught with people not who are saying, I have my truth and you have your truth relative to the person. Benedict's use of relativism and Francis's use. No, I have my truth, the conspiracy theory that I just heard, and it is the truth. You are wrong. And the way we're going to defend this truth is we're going to all go on the same social media sites and in a very tribal way, create a truth which may have no basis whatsoever in reality and be completely unopen to any kind of dialogue, debate, or conversation. So what Benedict called the dictatorship of relativism, I wonder if we're far from that now into, what some call the post-truth age of Trumpism, where people just, you use raw power to create truth and to impose it. Now, again, I'm not saying we've never been there. Colonialism has plagued this hemisphere for 500 years now, and the imposition of truth has been a long-standing part of our history. But our politics today are not plagued, I don't think so much more, with relativism. They are plagued with dueling monologues, which are all about getting my tribe together to impose my truth on the others. Relativism looks like a thing of the distant past, even though that was kind of the conversation just 10 years ago. So I'm very concerned about this common good question. I don't know how Jay would respond to what I'm saying, or he'll have some other thoughts, I'm sure, but how can we talk about a common good in a society that is just fraught with the kind of polarizations we're facing now? And people of faith like this group, how do we intervene to help our own people participate in this reality in a way that will lead us anywhere nearer compassion and justice?
Hugh, some comments on this topic, and then also I'll invite you to comment on any item or items that are glaringly absent from our 10 principles.
Well, I don't have a lot to add to what Jay and Tim have already articulated. I concur with Jay about the, at least within Anglican circles, the fundamental goodness of creation and the importance of affirming the sweetness, the wonder that is hardwired into our day-to-day reality. I think that's something that within certain sectors of the Black theological tradition is clearly affirmed. And also this idea that there's not a compartmentalization of the spiritual from the physical, that they interpenetrate, and that there is a wonder that is associated with everything that we see, everything that we touch, everything that we think. I also agree with Tim, with regard to the fraught nature of truth claims that compete in our modern economy of ideas. And there is an incredible amount of tribalism that has to be overcome at some point in the future. And I don't think that we're at a point where we're doing a very good job of managing it. I don't know that many of our religious institutions are equipped to tackle what we're actually seeing. And so we're creating strategies as we go along. I never thought that I would see the kind of acrimonious debate that we have just in terms of the public health sphere. But it is what it is at this point. We have to figure out how to navigate our way through it. The one thing, though, that I think is, I don't know that it's a glaring absence, but it's certainly something that needs to be taken into consideration when we look at the heterogeneous thought worlds that are a part of Black theology. And I don't see reflected in these 10 statements the what I would call the Afro-pragmatist tradition, which often aligns itself with the Black secular humanist tradition, and which some have often called an Afro-pessimist tradition, which I think is much too harsh a categorization. But, you know, I'm thinking of the work of someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates in Between the World and Me, and his rightful, I think, critique of, you know, this uncritical embrace of Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision of the dream and of dreamers, and not looking at the ways in which that dream has failed to be realized in 21st century America. You know, I also think of the work of someone like Anthony Pinn, who has raised questions about those who have looked at what they have seen in the larger realm of Christianity, and, you know, sought not to embrace it, sought to see humanity as the measure of all good. So I think we have to make room in these principles for those who conceive of the religious sphere in ways that are not necessarily theistic, strictly speaking. You know, you think about the number of African American Unitarians who are part of our community, and the various theological thinkers and philosophers and so forth who've raised really profound questions about the close association between, as Tim has said, the colonial enterprise in the Western world and forced coercion of subjugated peoples.
Yeah.
And if we're going to start doing theology from the bottom up and asking inconvenient questions about those things that subjugated peoples have been forced to adopt, then I think we have to make room for those who have considered themselves, for one reason or another, to be outside of the Christian mainstream, and why, and how we make room for their voices to be heard and honored.
Excellent point. Thank you for sharing that. Jay, Tim, any glaringly absent components that you would add?
Go ahead, Tim.
Jay, you can go ahead. Sure, I'll go next. Go ahead.
Okay. I don't, this may not be necessarily a glaring absence so much as a suggestion for a kind of revision, perhaps. As I looked at these 10, and this became even more apparent when Stephen put up on our screen that the list, the shorthand version of the list. What became really apparent when I saw that list, but I was thinking about it even reading the longer list. One of these is not like the others. And that's number 7. 7 is stated primarily as a negative principle, that we stand against racism and systemic exclusion, where all the other principles are framed in some kind of affirmation. And it seems to me like I think it would be really useful to begin that principle number 7 by turning it into, first of all, an affirmation by saying something like, we value racial and ethnic diversity as a way of manifesting God's own creative something or another. I don't know what it would be. I'm making this up off the top of my head right now, but and that the ways that we differ from each other are ways that mark pathways toward insight and healing and flourishing, something of that nature. In other words, a robust affirmation of how we are different from each other while still being profoundly related to each other, I think is something that I've tried to learn from queer and critical social theories. And I think it's really useful so that we're not talking about aiming toward a so-called colorblind society that we keep sort of hearing about in various sort of uncritical ways, but a really robust affirmation of our racial, ethnic, maybe also sexual and gender diversity. I don't know, but a really embracing of our differences might be useful there. Because if you look at the list that Stephen put up, by the way, you look at it and you go, wait, are we affirming racism and exclusion, or are we against it? Because it's sort of just listed there.
Yeah, a provocative point, and we'll have to do a lot of study on that. This is not an apologetic, but to provide some understanding why, in fact, it is the one negative. I think we were somewhat influenced by an earlier study of Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, kind of calling out racism. And then Robert Jones with the Public Religion Research Institute, who comments over and over again about racism being at least US Christianity's original sin, and an original sin that it has not yet confessed.
Oh, for sure.
With.
Oh, for sure.
So,
and I'm not saying that you should get rid of a direct, repudiation of racism and systemic exclusion, but I think giving the affirmative reason why, right? That
that's very helpful.
We affirm the diversity because and therefore, right?
Very helpful. Thank you. Other glaringly absent or perhaps just absent components.
I had another one. Number 9. Our faith traditions are grounded in preferential concerns for the poor, the vulnerable, alleviation of poverty, homelessness, and so on. So I'm speaking now from the perspective of liberation theologies of Latin America and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. The primary theological concept is the preferential option for the poor. Mm-hmm. This, I'm sure, is grounded in good compassionate desire, but it sounds like we're committed to do works to help the poor, as if they're the object of our mission, our action, when in fact the theological concept of preferential, I presume I'm saying this to people who already know a lot what I'm about to say. It's the idea that Jesus's ministry expressed the love of God for all, but first and foremost to those most marginalized, which was material poverty, but other kinds of marginalization as well, race, gender, and so on, as we're talking about tonight. It's involved with empowering those who are marginalized to be voices for themselves, to solve their own problems, so to speak, and to be, to recognize them as the active agents of history that they are. In our I'm Catholic, and the Catholic bishops' economic pastoral of years ago, they said one of the ramifications of this was we must ask economic, political, and social questions. And first and foremost, how does this appear to the poor? How are they among us? How are we accompanying them and listening to their voices as the guidance of what needs to be done to address particular issues? So, I think this is a good principle to have. I would maybe want to see it more talking about empowerment, engagement, uplifting of marginalized persons and voices. And it can come across, perhaps, I'm sure unintentionally, sort of sound like, we're going to do good actions and we're going to help, all very good stuff. But of course, the option for the poor is really ultimately about the revelation of God. Where does God speak in the world? First and foremost, God speaks among marginalized peoples. That was Jesus's way. That's supposed to be our way as his disciples. So that idea could be maybe captured more robustly in the way this is worded.
Excellent. Good point. Throughout this evening's discussion, you've been, all three of you, referencing a kind of a fuller nuancing of some key terms, from stranger to preferential option. So thank you very much for that. So given our time, let's move on to kind of the third question, which Jay, in fact, introduced a bit earlier. Do you find that these principles can lend themselves to the person in the worship space? For Christians, we often talk about, the person in the pew, but do they translate in a way that is simultaneously transformative, but also activist in nature?
I'll start off. I think that they have the potential so to do. But if I'm going to think about my own experience as a sometime Sunday worship leader and homilist, I would have to say that we've got a long way to go, at least within the larger Christian fold, of translating complex theological ideas and rationales for activism on behalf of those that are in need and are marginalized. The work is a heavy lift, and I have to acknowledge that, after more than 3 decades in this kind of work, that it's not something that those of us who go out into congregations are equipped to do well. And it's not something for which there are explicit rewards. And as a result, I don't think it's something that we can claim credit for having done an extraordinarily good job at. So I think that there's a good bit of work left to do, preparation left to do, but is it potentially worthwhile? Absolutely. And I would say that not just the future of our respective religious traditions depends on it, but I think the future of a global community in which we see our traditions as resources that promote the common good collectively. Goodness, the extent to which we still have work to do on that, I think, is pretty great.
Tim and Jay, any comments on that? And as Tim and Jay are commenting, for those of you who wish to ask a question or make a comment, raise your hand or place it in the chat. And then my colleague and our co-director, Stephen Slaubach, will be facilitating that conversation. Tim, Jay, any final comments on kind of the person in the worship space?
Well, I've got way too many things to say about that. So I will just, I was smiling when I was listening to you, Hugh, because it's not only, of course, that there are no explicit rewards for doing that work, say, in the pulpit, but there's often a cost to be paid by pastors who are trying to do that kind of public theology work in the congregation. Bobby knows very well. Bobby's here in the congregation. It's my privilege to serve. And, where I've had to start is by calming the nerves of people who are worried that I'm being political when I talk, that's the old saw about that. And so starting in a place of, what's the difference between being political and partisan, for example. But just the notion that theology has bearing on who we are in the public square is absolutely vital, I think, to every religious tradition today in terms of what we're trying to do, but especially Christianity, probably. And it's fraught. Oh my goodness, is it fraught in our country now for all sorts of reasons. But well, these principles, I think, would need to be, what do I want to say? For a lot of people here, I would venture to say there's not enough Jesus. in them for a Christian congregation to feel like they can find themselves and their faith in it. So that's a backdoor way of saying there's still a lot of the Christian congregations haven't done any interfaith work, generally speaking, at all. So the need to try to figure out how we have interfaith conversations and then how to take those conversations into the public square, that's a huge heavy lift, like Hugh said. I've said too much, but there's a lot of work to do.
Tim, final comments, and then we'll turn it over to Stephen.
Let me be brief so we can hear from the group. Like what's already been said by the two pastors, I'm the guy in the ivory tower, so I should be shorter on this one. Your second point on storytelling, I think, is reflected in what Hugh and Jay just said. I mean, how do you get to folks who maybe just aren't anywhere near these principles? The storytelling is so important. When we in Latinx theology and ministry, when we're dealing with people who are basically just very xenophobic and thinking, they're criminals, they're coming over here taking our jobs, it's very hard to break through that external wall. And one of the only ways is just tell stories. If you humanize the person who's supposedly the stranger or the other, you might have some chance of pulling off the miracle of converting a heart. I would also say from the Latinx perspective on this, Hugh and Jay have spoken very well about the pulpit. Latinx, I think a gift that our Latina sisters and brothers bring is their sense of public ritual and devotion. The devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, public rituals of Christ's passion, posadas and other things that they do. There are ways that public ritual can speak in the material sense that Jay was mentioning before. They kind of bypass the head and speak to the heart and speak to the soul. They allow you to actually walk with Jesus on Good Friday. I mean, as a non-Latino myself, I have been very moved by participating in these kinds of public rituals. And I think it's a beautiful gift that they give to Christianity and to the wider society in this country. So are there ways, and they're not the only ones that do this, African Americans, the spirituals, there are ways where we've had embodied forms of prayer that have touched people. So are there ways that worship styles that are embodied and deep and get people to think beyond the polarized sets of thoughts that are, ruling our minds right now and ruling our airwaves, and to get people to see and feel and think in a new way. That's easier said than done. I'm not saying, oh, there, I've said it now you pastors, you got it, go do it. It's easy to say, it's hard to do, but I do think it's something we got to keep working on if we're really going to incarnate these kinds of principles into the very fabric of our lives and our communities.
All right, well, thank you so much. This has been extremely enlightening and has raised a lot of excellent questions, but we want to hear from anyone else who's here tonight. If there are any comments or questions, feel free to raise your hand or even unmute and be happy to hear from you.
May I ask a question? Clark, are you the Clark Gilpin that was in Chicago all those years?
I was all those years. Yeah, that's right. How are you, Tim?
Very good. Nice to see you on this call and involved with this group.
Well, so now that I've been called out, let me say one thing. I do think you're zeroing in on point number 2, storytelling is absolutely crucial. And in some ways, the stories that we tell help us think our way through the complexities of some of the relational language that we spent the first part of our time talking about. Who is the stranger? I mean, in some ways, there's a long tradition of talk about conscience in the Christian tradition, in which I almost need to become a stranger to myself in order to discover myself. So these terms by which we try to figure out the dignity of our diversity, the common life, require stories to show that each one of these words has a kind of richness that I think many local congregations today don't have the equipment to unpack. And yet, if you took them to Steppenwolf Theater in Chicago, they would unpack that play. And I think, so my hope is that as we do move with these principles into local congregations, into groups of interns, perhaps a variety of things, that that the language of religion can become like the drama that we all see together, but that each of us takes away a slightly different message. And it's that diversity that creates the idea that is out in front of every one of us. It's out ahead of us. It's not my idea that's the truth. It's not even your idea. It's that idea that we create when we bring our different perspectives together. And so I totally agree with things that Hugh has said about, well, all three of you, about the need to think about what the common life is like in a highly plural world. And I think the stories of religion, in fact, are a huge resource that we have not delved into enough to accomplish that. So,
given time, perhaps that's an appropriate word of closing, because it also connects us to Fratelli Tutti, in which the Pope, in referencing the storytelling of Jesus, centered the entire encyclical on the story of the Good Samaritan as a means for understanding common good and tenderness and compassion and justice. So to all of you who have participated, to our wonderful discussants, you've given us an additional list to consider. We will reconvene as a drafting group, revise our principles based on the commentaries from our January session and from tonight's session. And then in March, on March 28th at 6 p.m., we will begin 45-minute discussion segments, beginning with our first principle, continuing throughout the calendar year, and completing discussions on each of the 10 principles. So to all of you, thanks for your participation tonight. To Tim, Hugh, and Jay, thank you for inspiring, challenging us, and giving us lots more reflection to do. Thanks again to everyone, and good evening.